Today we're talking about the adaptation of industries, brands, and people to disruptions. Our facilitator is Dawn Houghton. She is an industry legend with over 40 years experience with CPG and B2B innovation. Welcome, Dawn.
Hi, Gene.
Let's talk about theme number 1, trends and drivers. What are we going to talk about today?
Yes, this disruption board is just gotten started. This is our first theme, and it's all about understanding the trends and drivers that are creating disruption, as well as understanding how disruption itself is changing. So we asked our panel a few questions. What's causing or driving disruption? How are markets being disrupted? What trends do you see? How have disruptions changed over time? And I'll tell you, our panel has a lot to say on this topic.
Well, let's talk about your panel because it's quite diverse, isn't it?
Yes, we have a diverse group of functions covered and countries. It's a very global panel. We have people who come from marketing, innovation, R&D, even regulatory and academia. We have people from the U.S., India, Greece, the United Arab Emirates, Sweden, Austria, Portugal, Germany, Australia, and the Netherlands. So we're getting a very diverse perspective. In fact, this panel is absolutely on fire. We've had, I think, 49 or 50 contributions, and each of those contributions has 5 or 10 comments on it, a lot of great discussion, a lot of contribution to the media links to read up on disruption, and the map to look at different trends in disruption. This panel has a very high FAST score, which is a metric that Current uses to evaluate board quality. So we've got a really good quality board with a lot of great discussion that I hope we're able to summarize here because there's a lot to digest.
So as I'm looking at your executive summary, it looks like the theme is disruption is speeding up and there's a stronger need than ever to adapt.
Yes, Dean, that's true. We are in a digital revolution. It has led to disruption across many markets. What we see happening is consumer expectations are changing and they're increasing. The more you give consumers or customers, the more that they expect. And this is what is kind of fueling that rate of disruption. Not only is it fast, but our panel thinks that the speed is likely to increase in the future, and it certainly won't slow down. Companies are really challenged by this disruptive environment, and this is especially true for established market leaders. So the big companies who are leading in their respective markets are the ones most likely to be disrupted, and likewise, the small startup companies are the ones most likely to disrupt. But understanding disruption is important, especially for established market leaders, in order for them to survive and to thrive. Now, we do know a couple of the key points. Disruption is happening because consumer needs are not being met. So when that happens, there are companies, people, new technologies, et cetera, looking to solve the problems that people are experiencing, no matter what the market is. The changes in technology are so rapid that this has continued to fuel disruption across many different markets because solutions are possible now that were not possible in the past. We see changes in business models and, like I say, customer expectations keep increasing, especially challenging for market leaders. Now, I would like to say, if you're interested in this topic and you're viewing this report or podcast, I would suggest going into the actual board to read up because there is a lot of contribution and it is full and rich with examples that we just don't have room to include in this top line report.
So let's get into your key point number 1. You explain what causes disruption, which I know we've talked a little bit about, but tell us more.
Yeah, so why is disruption happening? If you look at different markets, they're ripe for disruption when the customer needs are not being met. Once there is a disruption, the markets change, companies respond, and the customer ends up winning. So while the companies are disrupted or disrupting, the customer stands to win in the end because their needs become met even more than they were before. We have 3 quotes here. Eric talks about how disruption happens when customers are either overserved, so for example, being charged too much for benefits they may not want, or underserved not getting benefits that they actually need. Samant talks about, well, it can also be about customers who've been ignored by market leaders. A lot of times the more niche market or smaller groups of consumers or customers are outside of the radar of the big players. They're not going to worry about, say, the 5 to 10% of the population. And disruptive companies can come in, focus on that 5 to 10%, and it just may happen that the majority appreciates those benefits even though they weren't first designed for them. Eric also talks about finding that sweet spot in value. So he had mentioned the overserving and the underserving, but what you really need to find is kind of the sweet spot where you're paying just the right amount for just the right amount of benefits. So disruption can happen from either end, or like Sumant says, with totally new customer target, but it needs to be the right value.
So let's talk about trends, because they also have an effect on disruption.
Yes. There are trends and drivers that kind of create this disruptive environment. And when we think about the trends driving disruption today, there really is a perfect storm going on. We have demographics changing. Millennials, Gen Z have grown up with smartphones. They've grown up with internet. They've grown up with Alexa and the like. So they have very high expectations and are very comfortable with technology. Globalization has brought things from one country to the other. Mobility has taught people to appreciate things that maybe they did not grow up with. There's an environmental awareness that is happening and concern, whether it be global warming or solar power or, whatever that would be. And then the whole digitalization thing. The technology changes, e-commerce, social media, all of these things have created this perfect storm. So while we think about all of the technical changes, we look here and talk about a couple things that are, say, non-technical trends. Famita talks about changing customer expectations. So people get more, they want more, and they want more. Okay, you never can quite satisfy them. The global environmental conditions and political unrest. These things are all providing or creating a situation where change is going to disrupt. And, political unrest, for example, people did talk in the panel about democracy is being disrupted around the world today and the way governments work. So it's not just about products and services. Disruption is all around us. We had people bring up, of course, millennials, Gen Z, the need for convenience. Branding is also changing. We'll probably get into this more in the future, but some of it, branding's becoming more important, and in other ways it's becoming irrelevant. There is the importance of experience versus stuff now. Bill talks here about how disruption is changing. So he talks about the economic history is a story of disruption driven by technologies, demographics, and climate and disease. Today's economic disruption is driven by the destructive end of the industrial age. So we think about the industrial age as kind of the manufacturing line that makes the automobile, how that changed the world. There are things like that throughout time that have really disrupted industry. And now we kind of are moving into this information age that is fueled by the digital revolution. And that's going to come up more and more in our other points as well. And Jacobs here also mentions some of the other parts of this and really Industry 4.0, which is the other name for the digital revolution.
So as we get into key point number 3, you talk about drivers of disruption, which is somewhat of a continuation, but explain.
So trends are some of the things that are happening all around us. Drivers tend to be the things that are creating the solution or making it happen. So the drivers are quite diverse. Obviously, the unmet needs create the pull. The ability to have business model changes and the advancement in technical capability, even the changes in government and regulatory requirements, are things that kind of drive this. So Laureen talks about in health and beauty aid products, there has been a lot of disruption in terms of value. So for example, Dollar Shave Club, it's a razor, but it's a different value equation. It's a little cheaper than your Gillette product that you're buying at Walmart or wherever, and it's coming to you directly. So it's a business model change in how you purchase it, and therefore changing the whole experience and value equation. Now, Jacobs talks about essential driving pillars that are driving disruption. So one, regulatory complacency. In fact, he uses as examples Uber and Airbnb. The current market leaders there are overwhelmed by regulatory requirements. So the taxi industry or the hotel industry have rules and the way that they work, whereas Uber and Airbnb kind of challenge those traditional ways or the rules and then are able to make big disruptive changes in those markets. Similarly, he talks about customer adoption efforts. So there are many disruptions that simply eliminate the middleman. A couple industries vulnerable to this are the auto dealership. The insurance industry is another example where, you have to have a relationship with an insurance salesman. Why does that have to be that way? So, those are things that are likely to change. And then the total user experience just has to improve. In fact, Jacob goes on to talk about how he predicts 10 industries that are very vulnerable to disruption in the future. So, for example, real estate, air travel, legal, healthcare are all industries that really haven't changed. I would actually even add government. The way that the government works is likely to be disrupted as well. Now, Famita talks about looking for dissatisfaction, and in industries like transport, hospitality, healthcare, and education, there is a lot of dissatisfaction, and that's going to lead to disruption in the future.
Now let's get into key point number 4, which are the trends that are coming up in disruption. I guess some of those we just talked about, but what do you see the trends?
Yes. So first of all, disruption is the new normal. We've gone from the industrial revolution to the digital revolution, and this digital transformation is going to continue. So disruption will lead to more disruption. And there's a term that was coined in here called serial disruption. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We also know from a trend standpoint that the successful corporate cultures that survive disruption will be more creative and be willing to take more risks than corporate cultures that are not as creative. And we do believe in this panel that self-disruption will become self-defense. So big companies are going to have to wake up to this disruption thing and be able to anticipate and prepare for it. Often, the big companies are ones who they know what could happen. They're having meetings regularly, strategic planning meetings, where they're talking about the likelihood of some of these disruptions happening and what it can do to them, but actually doing it is very hard if you are the market leader. And Rob says that here self-disruption is becoming more of a trend in all types of business models. Now, the winners will be the most creative, and then Ian's comment is about serial disruption. So serial disruption is companies like Apple who manage to disrupt a market and then, if you will, disrupt themselves before someone else disrupts them. Now, I do want to mention that there are a variety of definitions of disruption. Clayton Christensen is famous for defining disruptive innovation. And there are people who believe disruption is kind of technically defined and many things are not disruptive. So, for example, there was a discussion on Uber. There are people in the panel who are saying, Uber's not really disruption. It's still taxi service to get from here to there. It's just that you have an app. The app is not disruption. And then there's the other people saying, the taxi industry is being destroyed by Uber, therefore Uber is disruptive. So we kind of have said in this panel it's okay to use the word disruption or disruptive broadly. So if someone is disrupted, it's disruptive. Okay, so we're allowing that in there, but we do have some people reminding us of kind of some of these technical definitions and putting a higher bar on what a disruptive event is. But I'll tell you, if you're one of these companies who has been disrupted, it doesn't matter if it meets the definition or not, because it's changed your entire business and way of thinking. So we're going to allow that kind of discussion here.
So what is the future of disruption, no matter how you define it?
Yeah, no matter how you define it, the rate of disruption is likely to increase. It will be very challenging for companies to keep up. Now, I mentioned market leaders are the ones most at risk, right? They're leading in the market. They're winning financially. They're in a very good place, but they need to learn to adapt. Big companies typically know what all the needs and possibilities are. They're just cautious and they're afraid to act because they do need to. I think the Sumant quote here, existing giants think they are so big in size and resources that no one can disrupt them. They believe in their ability to acquire a disruptor, so they stay focused on their core strengths, wait and watch to avoid risk. Decision makers must answer to board and shareholders who are fine enjoying the profits with the business as status quo. So that is kind of the dilemma that the big companies are in. But in the future, think about regulatory, technology, innovation, and climate change. These are the three things that people have been talking about here that are going to disrupt in the future. Laureen talks about creativity being something that's going to lead and drive future disruption, especially for these serial disruptors. And Patrick talks about creativity. He also mentions that creative companies must have a very efficient internal structure with as little bureaucracy as possible. So when you think about the big companies have very big legal departments, they have financial departments, they have all these groups who are put in place to reduce and manage the risk of the company, and they generally slow things down. GRC means government, regulatory, and compliance. So that group needs to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And because really it's about ideas, having more ideas, and then making those ideas come to life. Now, in terms of the speed of disruption, there was so much discussion about, is disruption going so fast now? Change is happening so fast. Can it possibly continue? So we put out a question: how do you think the rate of disruption will change in the next 10 years versus the past 10 years? And I gave them 5 choices. It could be a lot slower, a bit slower, about the same, a bit faster, or a lot faster. What you can see here, we had 15 people voting, but nobody said slower. Not a bit slower, or not a lot slower. But a couple people said it would be about the same. But you can see the majority, 60% of the people voted a lot faster. So there were people likening this to Moore's Law, kind of the speed of disruption of memory on chip, the Intel CEO had coined. And that's how they're talking about kind of an exponential change. So expecting that disruption will happen a lot faster in the future, making this an even more important topic for market leaders and big companies to have a good understanding of.
Now, one of the things that Current produces using AI are these maps, which sort of take a look at all the comments and then rank them in terms of importance. So tell us about this map.
Yes. So in week 1 of the board, we had people introduce themselves and propose themes or trends in disruption that they think would be worth us discussing in future weeks. So I bring this up here to kind of highlight what the types of topics we might be talking in the future. If you look towards the top right, these are the ones most likely to disrupt that will have the most impact. And I know it's kind of hard to read here, but I can tell you the one on the top right is artificial intelligence. So ironically, this is produced in that manner. The one right beneath it is autonomous vehicles, drones, and robots. The next one in is legislation. The other ones towards the top right are technological convergence. And then the fifth one that shows up there is online versus offline. So these are the topics that people had a lot of energy for. You can see those rows to the top, but there's, probably 20 topics here that people had a lot of energy on. So like I say, this board is on fire, and we're going to have some great discussions coming in the future.
It must be very difficult to figure out the top 3 contributors, but due to our fancy AI, we were able to draw a conclusion. Tell us about the top 3 here.
Yes, you're exactly right. We probably had 10 or 15 people who went above and beyond in their contributions, not only in what they contributed themselves, but in their interaction with each other to kind of carry the conversation to the next level. So we have Rob. He's in the U.S. He's a consultant. He's got a lot of background in financial, and he talks about, kind of the disruption of the financial industry. There's some good history, and he shared quite a bit on branding and these types of things. Jacob lives in Austria, and he's written a book, Digital Transformation, about the Nigerian public service, but he has a lot of expertise in these areas. I think he may have academic experience as well. Sumant lives in India, and he is a consultant and has a lot of understanding as a market analyst and an entrepreneur himself. So he has, a lot of knowledge and observation of the market to draw from.
Well, you did a great job of wrangling this very rowdy panel, and I mean that in a good way. What can we look for in theme number 2, Dawn?
Well, thank you, Gene. And I do encourage people, if you're excited by this topic, get in there and spend some time reading it, because there's just so much more than can fit in this report. We just started theme 2, and already we have a lot of contributions. Our topic is going to be stories, really, of big company disruption. So when you think about over the past, say, 10 years, companies who have experienced disruption, who are the winners and who are the losers? We're going to look forward in 2 weeks to having some great stories to learn from on companies who have been disrupted.
Thank you, Dawn.
You're welcome.
Dawn Houghton, an industry legend. She has over 40 years of experience with CPG and B2B innovation, and I cannot wait for us to talk again. Thank you.